the studies that we are doing in doctoral education, but it's limited. They're limited methodologically, and they're limited because they do not probe deeply enough into the world of doctoral careers. And that's what we mean by doctoral career path studies. So for me, I want to ask these questions in the paper. How are the agendas of the research about doctoral education being constructed? And who's constructing them to begin with? And why, for what purpose? What are people interested in as they design studies in doctoral education? Whose interests are being perpetuated by the kinds of studies that are being conducted? Which particular organizations or institutions or individuals are asking these questions? Is it managers? Is it doctoral designers, designers of curricula? Is it doctoral students themselves? Who exactly is asking these questions? And what are they responding to? What is it that these students are, or these researchers are aiming to do when they engage with the doctoral career study? What's driving the research questions? And then whose interests are likely to be served via the agendas of these particular studies and their foci? I think my doctoral students will recognize this statement that comes up all the time. What's going under the microscope, right? How do we know what we actually are studying when we engage with a particular form of study? So that's what my interest is. So I'm going to talk on the European Union, and particularly the European Union Science Alliance, Alliance on Research Career Development, was an organization that tried to bring together, post the Bologna Accord, trying to understand comparability of doctoral qualifications across the different kinds of countries or programs or institutions that engage in doctoral studies. They were interested particularly initially on the brain drain from some countries into others, or the brain circulation that was happening only within the European Union. And therefore, they started to ask questions about how can we join up our thinking around doctoral education. But in 2012, they decided to look at doing the very kind of study that I've been suggesting that we should be doing, start to think about, let's gather information about where our doctoral students are going. And therefore, it brought together a group of individuals trying to understand this particular phenomenon. And in trying to do so, they were trying to establish what kind of methodologies should we use as we pursue this kind of study. So I'm going to talk about 5 particular examples, and there were several more. You can read the paper and the research from the research website. A report has been constructed around this. But I'm going to be looking at drawing inspiration from outside of the European Union in an established tradition already of doctoral education in the US. And in particular, I want to debunk some of the myths around employment trends of doctoral education coming from those particular studies in the US. And then also pay attention to how do they begin to define what quality education or doctoral education means. The second is a study on the OECD in Paris, who is trying to understand whether we should have a kind of TIMSS. Vijay will know what I'm talking about here. The TIMSS, a kind of international comparability study. Should we be having a standard format of comparing doctoral education in different countries? Should there be a singular instrument so that we can cross-compare? The other 2 studies are UK-based studies, the one by Cambridge University, who regularly does surveys of students in the labor market, where they end up in the labor market. And I'm questioning whether the study is actually about the labor market or whether it's about doctoral education at all. But we come to that in a moment. The Wellcome Trust is another study that I will be pointing to start to look at how to find new methodological ways of thinking about doing doctoral studies. And then I want to share with you France's interpretation of how to produce doctoral educations where, wait for it, almost 70% of their graduates are employed by the end of their doctoral graduation. So let's look at what they have to offer us. In particular, I want to start with the US study, and there are three main studies in the US that have been conducted in the field of doctoral education, ranging from 1996 to 1997 to 2006. And each of them draw on methodologically different samples in order to get different groupings of subjects or disciplines to see, is doctoral education in different disciplines different? What is unique about the doctoral education in each of those contexts? So you can see the studies vary in their sample size. They vary in the disciplines that they engage with. But what's innovative about it is that this study doesn't only look at what's going on inside the university system, but it's asking students to give their own personal perspectives of the experiences of doing doctoral education in all of those different institutions. So it's a very rich study, and a book has come out on this particular issue that's well worth reading as a reference. But Maresi Nirad, who actually reported on this, these kinds of national studies, suggested that it's about an obsession with comparison, an obsession with trying to understand whose is bigger, better, all right? And whether this is in competitive mode rather than in learning mode. Are we learning actually from these comparative studies, or is it just to place ourselves on a league table? Why are we doing these studies to begin with, is what she questions. So what she points to is certain myths that have emerged with respect to employment. And here are some of them. And here are the, and I want to caution that these are actually myths. She's suggesting, here's one myth that we need to debunk, that all doctoral students want to become professors. Of course, in the UK, they mean members of the academia, that by the word professor. Or that it's a highly desirable thing to become a member of the academia. Okay, I look at the members of the academia asking, is that your experience? Everybody rearing to go around this particular issue? Or that it's very easy to become a doctor, add water and mix, I always play around, right? You just follow these following steps and then you become an academic. Or are there other factors influencing why people might not choose to become an academic after their doctoral graduation? And then the third one is that people in academia are very happy. Okay? Of course, you can see they're all myths, all right? So let's look at the first myth, right? The first myth is, yes, there are lots of people who would want to become professors, but in fact, there are not many positions available for all doctoral students in the US to be absorbed into the academia to begin with. But what's more interesting is that if you ask different individuals or doctoral graduates from different disciplines, there's a range of different answers that you get. From engineers, only 19% of them want to actually become members of the academia. But if you ask the same question to biochemists, 32% of them want to become members of the academia. Okay, who do you think 72% of the students want to become members of the academia? Political science. Yeah. Okay. 81% of the English studies individuals want to actually become professors. What is this actually showing is that it's something got to do with the link to the economy. It's a link to how well are these individuals are being absorbed into the economy, and maybe that's why they end up in academia, because they couldn't get a job in the industry. All right? So is this the reason why we need to be thinking about employment and employment trends in different ways? So what we can see here is that it varies according to different disciplines. It also varies according to whether you're doing a professional doctorate or a PhD. The one aiming to give you practical skills to be able to engage with the world of work almost immediately, as opposed to those kind of PhDs which are about theoretical and academic pursuit or philosophical pursuit. All right? And what we're seeing is that the employment trends of these two different types of doctorates are different because of the nature of what the disciplines are. How are then we going to establish any kind of comparability between a science graduate and a humanities graduate if we're going to be engaging with a kind of uniform doctoral career path study and comparing everybody, apples with oranges, in terms of the nature of the doctoral study? So, the study also shows that there are many individuals who may not enter academia for other family or personal reasons. So, for example, you might have a bursary which takes you to the UK, and you have to return immediately to be employed back in the person who gave you the bursary. So therefore, that may be the reason why you're not entered into the academia in the institution that you studied at. But do those individuals who are produced overseas get absorbed back in their hometowns or in their home nations? That is the question that I think we need to be putting on the table as we understand this issue of doctoral education. Another example is that 61% of the women surveyed in this particular study, 61% of the women graduates had a partner who was highly educated and in a permanent job. So therefore, most of those individuals could not uproot and move into a new place in another space, in another town, because they were constrained by the family context. So what we're needing to be doing in our methodological pursuits is try to understand the specificities of who the doctoral graduates are. Who are their families? How are they linked with each other? By the way, only 32% of the men graduates in the study had individuals or partners who were highly educated or had high degrees, honors, master's degrees. So it is likely that men are more able to move into different contexts than women able to move into different contexts. Take a job in UCT, Leanne, and leave Greg behind at UKZN. Is that possible? So we need to be taking on a much more deeper understanding of our doctoral education processes. So another point in the study is that what we notice in the patterns of hiring is all the patterns of inequity recur. Hiring patterns of race, gender, multiply themselves, as we see in the South African context in particular. And herein lies a problem. And here we have the Employment Equity Act. I don't myself believe that this is a solution to the problem. It confounds the problem, in my opinion. But here we have a way of being able to address these patterns of recurring hiring of individuals who look like yourself, epistemologically, methodologically, racially, contextually, sexually orientated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those become the means by which hiring patterns evolve in doctoral education. So doctoral education is not immune from the patterns of inclusion and exclusion that we see in the wider society. And in fact, conservative academics love to replicate themselves. They love to see themselves in the next generation of the academia. And what we're seeing in doctoral education is patterns of perpetuation of self. And herein lies another researchable area in the study. Now, myths 2 and 3, I'm joining together for the sake of brevity, I hope, that in fact, different kinds of PhDs enter into the world of work much more rapidly. So engineers, surprisingly, almost immediately. Science and engineers, almost immediately. But the study shows that 75% of the social science graduates are still unemployed 4 years later. Okay? So they're not absorbed into the economy. So the question is, why do we have an underrepresentation of certain doctoral studies? It's also about the patterns of hiring of different disciplines as well. So we need to understand, as I've said earlier, the distinction between professional and academic doctorates, and that to realize that if you're going to understand doctoral education, you can't understand it in a narrow one-to-one correspondence for this following reason. That many doctoral students, in fact, do not thereafter profess in the very areas in which they were graduated. So Saras's study on a particular phenomenon, and where is she and what does she do today, is very different. So what we're seeing in doctoral education is that people move well wider and beyond the sphere of what they actually trained to do. So if you're going to conduct doctoral studies education and ask, was your PhD of any value to your existing work? The answer is likely to be possibly no, because I don't actually use it at all. But I might use the way in which I systemically and systematically learned how to do research. So what is the value of actually doing a PhD is the question that's coming through this particular study. Myth 4. Okay, you all know the answer to this question, all right? Certainly not all of them enjoy their job. Now, if you ask most of the professors and members of the executive, this is not an insult to you, but this is what the study showed. That the people that were more happy with being in university were members in the executive and the top management. The rank and file actually were not as happy. Not my data of the study. Okay? So the individuals who were more satisfied with the work, the thing that the rank and file were most complaining about were complaining about the quality of their work environment. That is the issue that was they were most dissatisfied with. And interestingly enough, when they were compared with the group of students from business, government, and industry, that those individuals who were in those jobs or employment felt better job satisfaction. Interesting. And more interesting, that they felt a greater degree of professional autonomy. Now, this raises a serious question to, is our higher education system negating the very goals by which we think doctoral education should be producing? Professional autonomy, job satisfaction, growth and development. Of course, there's a lovely footnote in the study which says, but higher education salaries in the US are more lucrative in higher education. That might explain it, that people are joining academia because there was more stability in the job, and that there is likely to be a greater prospect for career mobility. Is this true for South Africa? I'm not too sure. That's what we need to be studying. I'm opening up this agenda for study. If we look at this particular study to try and understand what are we learning about the quality of doctoral education, what we see is that doctoral graduates are not complaining about the quality of their academic supervision, where a lot of attention seems to be directed, or about the quality of the content of what they need to be studying. That's not what they are concerned about. They are concerned about personal, emotional, social, family issues. They are concerned most about how academia forgets that we lived human beings, that we actually have a life beyond academia, and that we are actually gendered, raced, sexed, familied, etc., as we're engaging with this particular study. And in fact, this is not what is beginning to be on the agenda for most doctoral studies research. It ends up being in a very productivity mode that we're engaging with thinking about doctoral career paths. So this is what the study says. Universities need to recognize that most men and women are in relationships, many with children, and this situation influences their career paths. They need to pay more attention to connecting other aspects of the training of becoming a doctoral educated student, teaching, writing, publishing. Universities need to concern themselves with professional development competencies such as teamwork, working in interdisciplinary contexts, grant writing, managing people, managing budgets. This quite clearly is often not on the agenda for doctoral education. And certainly it's an area that we have been paying attention to in our School of Education to be able to produce a quality PhD program. So nevertheless, all of this points to what kinds of methodologies are we going to actually use if we're going to do doctoral career path studies to begin with. Can we go with only survey methodologies, which, by the way, the vast majority of the studies I've described above, that's the studies that they actually use. That's the methodologies they're actually using. What I'm pointing to is if the results are actually showing us that we needed to understand doctoral education in a different way, we can't research it in the same way. We have to find new ways of researching our doctoral career path studies. And this one-to-one correspondence of how well did you like your PhD is not actually going to yield anything of value. I want to move on. OECD, the study in this particular focus was, should we have an international benchmark? The same instrument that's compared so that we can compare apples with apples. What Misu, who's a Japanese studying in France, interesting, writing about doctoral education in the European Union, just noting the way in which the internationalization of PhDs is occurring, he suggests, okay, whose benchmark are we actually going to use about what is the doctoral study? He argues that it is more important to talk about the dialogue about why do we need such a study to begin with? Why do we need such an instrument to begin with? Why do we need comparability to begin with? What's lying behind the comparability? So he suggests that first of all, you need to clarify what's a doctoral student. And herein lies the first problem, because the concept of what a doctoral, and you can see the names differ, student, candidate, doctoral researcher, research assistant, etc., etc. In different programs throughout the world, the concept of who a doctoral education student is very different. So in Germany, for example, you might be employed as a research assistant for many years. Just about as the study is reaching its findings, you might then register for a doctoral education, for a PhD, produce a paper in conjunction with your supervisors, which might take 2 or 3 months, and then you become a doctoral graduate. I'm summarizing a longer process, as you can well imagine. But the question is, at which point did the doctoral education actually start? When did the person register to become a doctoral student? When does doctoral education actually begin? So it's opened and varied. Different institutions, different programs, all have very different understandings about what a doctoral graduate is to begin with, or doctoral student, or doctoral candidate. It also has a different understanding of what a supervisor is. How many should there be? Should there be a team? Should there be a single one-on-one version, etc., etc., etc.? So comparing with these different, Miso is suggesting no. He argues that if we choose one standard, it's likely that we're introducing a hegemonic force into the context that might actually be privileging a particular understanding about what doctoral education is. So he's against this idea of a research instrument. So there is not any common agreement about a form of a doctorate. It's varied in purpose, its length, and its form. Now, the UK study offers us, and you can see what its focuses are. It's the UK study looking at individuals asked the same questions at different points in their careers, even before they join a doctoral education program. Why are you joining a doctoral program?